55 G. F. Lowenstein, E. U. Weber, CKHC and N. Welch, Risk as Feelings, Psychological Bulletin 120. Becoming a behavioral investor. We create our fate every day. Most of the ills we suffer from are directly traceable to our own behavior. Henry Miller. Japanese director Akira Kurosawa is perhaps best known for his masterpiece Seven Samurai, but it was a different film, Rashomon, that was actually his breakthrough work. Rashomon, winner of the 1952 Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film, depicts the trial of a notorious criminal who stands accused of murdering a samurai and raping his wife. The incident is recounted by 4 different witnesses: the accused, the deceased, through a spiritual medium, a priest and a woodcutter, all of whom present conflicting but earnest stories. The film is an examination of the subjective nature of truth and plays up the ways in which experience, motivation and personality impact our judgments. The moral of the story being that the various testimonials said more about the people speaking than the actual events under scrutiny. One of the first to study the subjectivity of truth in a controlled academic setting was Sir Frederick Bartlett, head of the psychology department at Cambridge University. Bartlett operationalized this concept by asking participants in his study to read a Native American folk tale and recall it at several later dates. Bartlett found that when subjects were asked to recount the story, they tended to alter it to reflect their own priorities and cultural milieu. They omitted parts of the story they found unpleasant or foreign and swapped out Native American cultural particularities in favor of their own norms. As Mo Costandi points out, Bartlett pioneered the idea that memory was as much reconstructive as it is reproductive. 57 Left to our own devices, we create portfolios in our own image. Americans buy American stocks. Steel workers are overweight manufacturing, while financiers double down on bank stocks. The timid fail to allocate to equities and the overconfident hold large positions in single stocks. Like an old married couple, our holdings start to look just like us, and there is great danger in that similarity. The interpersonal differences born of our biological, psychological and neurological differences are what make the world a fascinating place, but Wall Street is no place to give voice to that uniqueness. The job of an individual is to craft a story that only she can write and to see the world through a lens unlike any other. The job of an investor, on the other hand, is to view the market today the way that others will tomorrow. Becoming an individual requires expression of self, but becoming a behavioral investor requires subjugation of self. Bending your will against its most primal biopsychosocial longings is one of the hardest and potentially most rewarding things you will ever do. In Part 3, we will examine specific ways to do just that. Sigmund Freud began his study of the human psyche by outlining how it was broken. Hint. Your mom, and the discipline of psychoanalysis continued down that path for over a century. It was roughly 150 years before the study of clinical psychology was offset at all by the research into what we now call positive psychology, the study of what makes us happy, strong and exceptional. For a clinical psychologist, a diagnosis is a necessary but far from sufficient part of a treatment plan. No shrink worth his $200 an hour would label you pathological and show you the door, yet that is largely what behavioral finance has given the investing public. A long list of biases with very few solutions. But that all ends today, as we will take the 4 pillars of behavioral risk management identified in Part 2 and speak to the particulars of what they mean in the context of managing money. By way of quick reminder, they are: ego, tendency toward overconfidence and behaving in ways that maintain feelings of personal competency over clear-eyed decision-making; conservatism, asymmetrical preference for gain relative to loss and for the status quo relative to change; attention, disposition to evaluate information in relative terms and let salience trump probability when making decisions; emotion, perceptions of risk and safety that are colored by both our transitory emotional state and personal level of emotional stability. Having read Parts 1 and 2, you now understand the "why does this happen?" of misbehavior, but still lack clarity around the "so, what do I do about it?" Let us begin that journey by examining the means by which we can construct ego-resistant portfolios by asking, do we really have anything to be cocky about? Notes. 57 Mo Costandi, Reconstructive Memory, Confabulating the Past, Simulating the Future, Neurophilosophy, January 9, 2007. Com. Chapter 8, The Behavioral Investor Overcomes Ego. One of the painful things about our time is that those who feel certainty are stupid, and those with any imagination and understanding are filled with doubt and indecision. Bertrand Russell. Part of me suspects that I'm a loser, and the other part of me thinks I'm God Almighty. John Lennon. The sinking of the Titanic, the nuclear meltdown at Chernobyl, the tragedy of Space Shuttle Challenger, the Deepwater Horizon spill, and the founding of your favorite restaurant may not seem to have much in common, but all of these events are rooted in a deep sense of overconfidence. It must be plainly stated that overconfidence isn't all bad, at least in certain contexts. We more or less demand ego from our politicians, and it is also required of restaurateurs and entrepreneurs, both of whom start new enterprises in the face of overwhelmingly negative probabilities. 0.58 So, what determines if overconfidence is the get you out of bed to chase your dreams kind or the catastrophic disaster kind? To begin to answer this, we will examine the evolutionary roots of ego and the different contexts in which it can help and hinder us. Dr. Talai Sharad, professor of cognitive psychology at University College London, suggests that over-optimism impacts about 80% of us. Citing a humorous example, she reports that 75% of people thought good things were in store for their families, but just 30% thought families in general were headed for good times. 0.59 In Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman also gives a nod to the ubiquity of overconfidence, calling it the most significant of the cognitive biases, and suggesting in an interview that it is the one he'd choose to eliminate if he could do so with the wave of a magic wand. 60 Kahneman has also suggested that overconfidence is the bias that emboldens all other biases, justifying sloppy and ill-considered behavior. Understanding that human nature does not evolve arbitrarily, it seems evident that overconfidence must serve us well in some places and at some times, and indeed that is the case. To begin to unpack the evolutionarily adaptive elements of overconfidence, we must first understand that it is itself a multifaceted construct. In specific, there are three types of overconfidence. 61 Overprecision, excessive certainty in the precision of private beliefs. Overplacement, elevated belief in personal skill relative to others. Overestimation, unrealistic optimism about the level of control and odds of success. Overprecision. Take overprecision, for example. If I asked you to name how many books there are in the Bible and instructed you to provide a range that you were certain encompassed the actual number, what range would you provide? Go on, give it a shot. You might give a range of something like 25 to 50 books. There are actually 66 books in the King James Bible, 80 if you count the Apocrypha. But stop and think about the question for a moment. I asked for a range that would almost certainly provide the correct number, so why didn't you guess 1 to 10 million inches? An answer like 1 to 10 million has the distinction of being technically correct but practically useless. Under conditions of uncertainty, we humans do our best to be useful, even if that precision is found lacking with regularity. Likewise, if a stock analyst is asked for her forecast on the share price of Apple 1 year hence, she is likely to provide an overly precise number like $173.42. This is well intended, to be sure, and is rooted in the understandable tendency to privilege faux precision over vague accuracy. Sadly, it can also be unintentionally misleading and cause others who act on these predictions to believe in a world that is more predictable than it actually is. As a direct result of overprecision, contrarian investor David Dreman found that most 59% Wall Street consensus forecasts miss their targets by gaps so large as to make the results unusable, either under or overshooting the actual number by more than 15%. 62 Further analysis by Dreman found that from 1973 to 1993, the nearly 80,000 estimates he looked at had a mere 1 in 170 chance of being within 5% of the actual number. 63. James Montier sheds some light on the difficulty of forecasting in his little book of behavioral investing. In 2000, the average target price of stocks was 37% above market price and they ended up 16%. In 2008, the average forecast was a 28% increase and the market fell 40%. Between 2000 and 2008, analysts failed to even get the direction right in 4 out of the 9 years. Finally, Michael Sandretto of Harvard and Sudhir Milkrishnamurthy of MIT looked at the 1-year forecasts of the 1,000 companies covered most widely by analysts. They found that the analysts were consistently inconsistent, missing the mark by an annual rate of 31.3% on average. 64 The only accurate equity forecast is, I have no idea and neither does anyone else, But estimates like that don't provide lobster lunches and fail to meet our need for a belief in a knowable future. Overplacement. Overplacement is what most people think of when they think of overconfidence. We judge our own performance as being superior to others. In a 2006 study entitled, Behaving Badly, researcher James Montier found that 74% of the 300 professional fund managers surveyed believed that they had delivered above-average job performance. Of the remaining 26% surveyed, the majority viewed themselves as average. Incredibly, almost 100% of the survey group believed that their job performance was average or better. Clearly, only 50% of the sample can be above average, suggesting the irrationally high level of overconfidence these fund managers exhibited. In their The Evolution of Overconfidence, Johnson and Fowler suggest that overconfidence may increase resolve, ambition, persistence and competition for scarce resources. 65 They present a model that suggests that overconfidence is a natural and even desirable evolutionary outcome that maximizes individual fitness and group stability when the resources at stake in a conflict are greater than the cost of competition. Overestimation. Overestimation is evident in a Cook College study in which people were asked to rate the likelihood that a number of positive events, e.g., win the lottery, marry for life, and negative events, e.g., die of cancer, get divorced, would impact their lives. What they found was hardly surprising. Participants overestimated the likelihood of positive events by 15% and underestimated the probability of negative events by 20%. Likewise, Heather Lench and Peter Ditto performed a study where participants were shown 6 positive and 6 negative life events as well as their accompanying probability in the general population. Respondents endorsed 4.75 of the 6 positive life events as probably impacting them. In her TED Talk, Dr. Talai Shara speaks to some of the ways in which overestimation can impact our reasoning. She relates that overconfidence makes it hard for us to learn from new information and suggests that we are prone to revise our beliefs only when it suits us. She shares that patients who assume that they have a 50% chance of cancer and are informed that their odds are lower, say 30%, revise their opinion to around 35% when asked for a second estimate. However, when the new information is not in their favor, say a 10% estimated chance of cancer with a 30% actual incidence, their second guess is only slightly revised upward to 11%. Overestimation means that we tend to see our lives as subject to a different set of rules and probabilities than the rest of the world, and not even factual information can do much to alter that view. Overconfidence is largely presented in a comical, aren't we so silly and cocky, manner that belies its complexity and the real social, financial and evolutionary advantages that can accrue to the egotistical in many domains. Overconfidence has been shown to confer advantages in sports, politics and even health. Overconfident people show more resiliency in the face of setbacks, tackle more ambitious projects and are even deemed more mentally healthy than their lower confidence counterparts. 66. But while overconfidence may confer some specific advantages, our particular interest in the construct is more niche. And when it comes to business in general and investing in specific, there appears to be very little to recommend it. A Bain study found that 80% of CEOs believe that they are delivering a superior experience to customers, while only 8% of customers agree. 67 The Employee Benefit Research Institute, EBRI, found that 60% of those surveyed felt they'd be able to save enough for a comfortable retirement, but that only 41% of those surveyed had ever tried to calculate how much money they'd actually need for a comfortable retirement. 68 Statman, Thorley and Vorkink found that investors absolutely confuse brains with a bull market, attributing their own success to skill and not the fact that a rising tide had lifted all boats. 69 As a result, trading volumes were found to rise dramatically following good times and fall precipitously in bad times, effectively buying high and selling low. The authors of Positive Illusions and Forecasting Errors in Mutual Fund Investment Decisions discovered that most participants had consistently overestimated both the future and past performance of their investments. 70 1/3 of those who believed that they had outperformed the market had actually lagged by at least 5%, and another quarter of people lagged by 15% or greater. Even more damning research is found by Glazer and Weber, who discovered that investors are unable to give a correct estimate of their own past portfolio performance. The correlation coefficient between return estimates and realized returns was not distinguishable from 0. 71 The finding that investors would misstate their returns is not entirely surprising, but the size and scope of the problem is. Only 30% of those surveyed considered themselves to be average investors, and the average overestimation of returns was 11.5% per year. More shocking still, portfolio performance was negatively tied to the difference between estimates and actual returns. The lower the returns, the worse investors were at remembering their realized returns. Overconfidence simply made it impossible for them to accurately recall and report how they had done. An elevated sense of self may get you a spouse or a Senate seat, but the same ego that elevates the politician can destroy an investor. Rational behavior, truly considered, is less about conforming to some universal standard of clear thinking and more about tailoring your approach to the context in consideration. When it comes to investment decision-making, the most rational among us will check the ego at the door. Tools for combating ego. If you're now convinced of the need for greater humility in your investment approach, a natural next question is, where do I start? The journey toward admitting ignorance and culpability is winding and difficult, but has both financial and relational rewards. Here are some things you can do. Spread the wealth. My favorite part of any public speaking event is connecting with the attendees who approach the stage once I have finished. These interactions, which are as close as you get to the comments section of a web article in real life, typically take one of three forms: compliment, criticism, or consulting. I can almost invariably discern which is coming from the look on the face of the approaching party. On one memorable occasion, I was approached by an unusually long series of individuals who, as expected, thanked me for my work, told me I was an idiot, and asked me for free advice. While the person who told me I was an idiot was arguably the most interesting and accurate, I'd like to focus on the person who asked for my advice on one stock in particular, Apple. The gentleman, after a brief thanks for the presentation, asked for my opinion of Apple stock as it made up a large portion of his $2 million portfolio. Now, I held the stock in my separate account strategies at the time, and it was the highest rated stock in my investable universe at that very moment. I could not have been more bullish on Apple. But rather than providing my take on what I saw to be Apple's considerable upside, I keyed in on another part of his question. How large is your position? I asked. Half of my wealth, he replied sheepishly. My reply was reflexive. You're being an idiot and you know it. No matter what I think of it, you're grossly misallocated. Since that time, Apple shares have gone from $74 to $142, but I still hope that the man heeded my advice that day to diversify his position. One of the most important rules of behavioral investing is that results matter less than the process. You can be right and still be a moron. Diversification has become such a broadly accepted good in asset management that it seems many have forgotten the underlying reasons for doing it. Considered from a behavioral lens, diversification is humility made flesh, the embodiment of managing ego risk. Diversification is a concrete nod to the luck and uncertainty inherent in money management and an admission that the future is unknowable. As evidenced by the J.P. Morgan research in the following table, single stock ownership can indeed be harrowing, with nearly half of all stocks suffering catastrophic losses in their lifetime. But diversification is a lot like medicine, or candy, or children, in the sense that some is good but more is not always better. In fact, diversification can be achieved with fewer holdings than most understand, and over-diversification can be an impediment. Catastrophic losses of single stocks. Sector total percent of companies experiencing catastrophic loss, 1980 to 2014. All sectors 40%. Consumer discretionary 43%. Consumer staples 26%. Energy 47%. Materials 34%. Industrials 35%. Healthcare 42%. Financials 25%. Information technology 57%. Telecommunication services 51%. Utilities 13%. Source: Isaac Presley. How concentrated is too concentrated? A mistake that costs you the whole war. CordonWealth.com. It does not take hundreds of stocks to create a truly diversified equity portfolio. One of the earliest studies to refute this misconception was conducted by John Evans and Stephen Archer of the University of Washington. Evans and Archer found that the benefits of diversification dropped off precipitously when more than 20 stocks were added to a portfolio. Riley and Brown second this idea in their book, Investment Analysis and Portfolio Management, when they note, about 90% of the maximum benefit of diversification was derived from portfolios of 12 to 18 stocks. Further, Billionaire investor Joel Greenblatt says in his book you can be a stock market genius that non-market, i.e., diversifiable, risk is reduced by 46% by owning just 2 stocks, 72% with 4 stocks, 81% with 8 stocks and 93% with as few as 16 stocks. Greenblatt's work shows just how quickly most of the benefits of diversification can be achieved and also how quickly they begin to erode after about the 20 stock point. Finally, Morningstar examined the volatility of high conviction, i.e., less than 40 stocks, versus those with more than 200 holdings and found that concentrated funds aren't more volatile than more diversified funds on average, and some are surprisingly steady despite their small number of holdings. It is no coincidence that there is almost universal consensus among the world's greatest investors about the appropriate number of holdings to balance diversification and performance. Diversification, truly understood, is not some game whereby we accumulate large numbers of holdings for their own sake, but rather an attempt to insulate ourselves against catastrophic loss. Considered in this light, it becomes just as important that we know something about what we own as it is to own the appropriate quantity. Much of the work of the behavioral investor is to cut through the extreme notions of various schools of thought and to find a sensible middle path. The idea that owning just a few stocks is sufficient flies in the face of everything that we know about luck, uncertainty and human fallibility and is therefore foolish. But on the flip side, the idea that one must buy the entire market to be diversified is just as ridiculous. The idea that nothing can be known about a security and that none of the information available, prices, trends, financial and quality metrics, the behavior of insiders, gives any insight into how risky an investment is so pessimistic as to be absurd. It is egoistic in the extreme to assume that you can predict the future, but nihilistic in the extreme to assume that nothing can be known. A sensible middle ground guards against catastrophic loss by diversifying a portfolio adequately to minimize idiosyncratic risk while holding few enough securities that they can be properly vetted. As Buffett wrote in a 1993 shareholder letter, we believe that a policy of portfolio concentration may well decrease risk if it raises, as it should, both the intensity with which an investor thinks about a business and the comfort level he must feel with its economic characteristics before buying into it. In stating this opinion, we define risk, using dictionary terms, as the possibility of loss or injury. Seth Klarman further speaks to the relationship between conviction and risk management in the aptly named margin of safety. My view is that an investor is better off knowing a lot about a few investments than knowing only a little about each of a great many holdings. One's very best ideas are likely to generate higher returns for a given level of risk than one's 100th or 1000th best idea. Protection against ruinous wealth destruction is partially a numbers game but is equally a product of deep understanding. A desire for conformity is part of the human condition, even, and perhaps, especially, for those who deny this most vehemently. Exactitudes, a contraction of the words exact and attitudes, is a book that showcases the ways in which even self-professed nonconformists adhere to a rigid set of social norms. The brainchild of photographer Ari Verslaus and stylist Ellie Iddenbrook, the book chronicles sets of 12 individuals who belong to cultural subgroups like punks, soccer hooligans, pin-up girls, and backpackers. The irony of these photos of ostensible deviance is the total lack of deviation among their dress and postures. The studded leather chain, mohawk and ripped jeans of a gutter punk are no less a uniform than the blue blazer and loafers of a preppy. We are all snowflakes, just like everyone else. Similarly, something like 100% of active managers you speak to would mention contrarianism as a foundational value, even as 3/4 of them imitate a benchmark for a disgustingly high fee. Passive management is sensible. True active management is sensible. High fee, low conviction asset management, which currently accounts for most of what passes as active, is a cancer to investors that should be conspicuously avoided. Diversification is a concept that has more nuance than is commonly realized, and for its potential to be truly realized it must be numerically robust, fundamentally vetted and express a unique viewpoint. Famous investors and their ideas about diversification. Benjamin Graham 10 to 30 holdings of large, prominent, conservatively financed companies. John Maynard Keynes 12 or 13 companies, which one thinks one knows something about and in the management of which one thoroughly believes. Warren Buffett 5 to 10 holdings, if you are a know-something investor, able to understand business economics and to find sensibly priced companies that possess important long-term competitive advantages. Seth Klarman 10 to 15, because you are better off knowing a lot about a few investments than knowing only a little about each of a great many holdings. Those who can, teach. A quick question for you, gentle reader. Do you know how a toilet works? On a scale from 1 to 10, how familiar would you say you are with the workings of a toilet? Go ahead and answer. All done? Great. Now, explain to me in detail the mechanics of a toilet. I'll wait. Done? Okay. Now let me ask again. On a scale of 1 to 10, how well do you understand the workings of a toilet? Research by Stephen Sloman of Brown and Philip Fernbach at the University of Colorado shows that having to teach a concept has a humbling effect that brings our beliefs more in line with our actual understanding. The pair have used this technique to moderate beliefs about everything from single-payer healthcare to, well, toilets, and have found that, as a rule, strong feelings about issues do not emerge from deep understanding. This exercise is commonly referred to as the Feynman technique and is named for the theoretical physicist of the same name. Richard Feynman, known for his work in quantum mechanics, set forth a simple, three-part formula for gaining greater knowledge. Figure out what you don't know. Educate yourself. Teach it to a child or novice. Feynman's technique, elegant in its simplicity, speaks both to the human tendency to overestimate our own capabilities and to conflate complexity with understanding. The act of writing, teaching, or explaining a concept to an absolute beginner has a humbling effect that provides a more accurate measure of our understanding. The next time you feel as though you must buy or sell a security, or that you are certain of where the financial markets are headed, take a moment to explain, in detail, the factual reasons why this is so. You're likely to find that your enthusiasm has gotten the best of your brain and nothing brings them back into sync like having to teach. Take the outside view. When making a decision, we tend to rely on what social scientists call the inside view. The inside view is our perception of a decision as informed by our own biases, anecdotal experience, and a convenience sample of whatever data pops to mind first. Conversely, taking the outside view means a more dispassionate appraisal that depends more on probability and facts than convenience and personal experience. In Think Twice, Michael Mauboussin sets forth 4 steps to taking an outside view of a problem. They are: select a reference class, compare your problem to other problems like it. Assess the distribution of outcomes, examine rates of success and failure. Estimate probabilities. Based on the external evidence, estimate timelines, failure rates, and obstacles to success. Fine-tune your prediction. Let bumps in the road and changing circumstances alter your estimate accordingly. By relying on external data, you are likely to arrive at a much more realistic picture than by leaning on your personal experience. If it takes most people 2 years to complete a task, you are unlikely to finish yours in 6 months. The outside view is an effective way of combating ego risk by reminding you that you're pretty much just like everyone else. Man of Steel. You've likely heard of a straw man argument in which a weakened caricature of an opposing opinion is presented, only to be dismantled. A less discussed but more effective critical thinking technique is to create a steel man, which represents the very best thinking and most rigorous empirical proof of an opinion with which you disagree. Rather than using the straw man as a rhetorical punching bag to feed your ego, build a steel man that will sharpen your thinking, cause you to look in dark corners and consider new vantages. Love the questions. In Letters to a Young Poet, Rainer Maria Rilke writes to his protégé, "I want to beg you, as much as I can, dear sir, to be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart and to try to love the questions themselves like locked rooms and like books that are written in a very foreign tongue. Do not now seek the answers, which cannot be given you because you would not be able to live them. And the point is, to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer." Western culture is in love with certainty and bravado, but the uncertainty of markets necessitates that we pursue a dynamic approach that is rooted in a fascination with the process rather than looking for silver bullets. The paradoxical truth is that only by learning to love the questions will we ever find the answers. Take your time. For years, scientists have puzzled at the evolutionary reason for depression. Species tend not to adapt in ways that are self-harming, and yet depression on its face does very little good and a whole lot of harm to the organisms it touches. But more recent research shows that deep sadness may have a strong evolutionary purpose that is rooted in the depressive tendency to ruminate on problems. By playing and replaying a negative event over and over in our minds, we often arrive at solutions that can be called upon at a future date. What hurts in the moment may be profoundly beneficial down the road. We would do well to follow the admonition of John Dewey in how we think. To be genuinely thoughtful, we must be willing to sustain and protract that state of doubt which is the stimulus to thorough inquiry, so as not to accept an idea or make a positive assertion of a belief, until justifying reasons have been found. Listen to the master. David Dunning of Dunning-Kruger fame gives 4 tips for managing overconfidence. 72. Always be learning. It is a strange quirk of human behavior that the more you learn, the less certain you tend to become. Dunning suggests a lifelong commitment to learning as a paradoxical means by which to attain humility. Beware beginnings. Pursuant to the first recommendation, Dunning cautions that a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, and that early immersion in an idea or project can give a thin veneer of knowledge that feels more meaningful than it is. Slow down. Fast thinking is biased thinking. Moving at speed requires us to rely on heuristics that have worked in the past rather than thoroughly examining a problem from top to bottom. While this is a fine way to make low-stakes, quotidian choices, it's no way to invest time or money in matters that are truly important. Know when to be confident. Dunning appropriately acknowledges that confidence has its place, especially when it comes to persuading others about our ideas. He suggests that we should be cautious in the appraisal and preparation of a proposal and confident in its eventual delivery. Follow the crowd. The herd tends to get a bad reputation in behavioral finance circles, but under certain circumstances there is indeed wisdom in the opinions of many different stakeholders. Pooled judgments have shown great predictive power in areas as diverse as Hollywood blockbusters, sporting outcomes, and election results. Averaged economic indicators are also greatly improved over the judgment of the typical estimate. 0.73. What's more, this effect is seen relatively quickly, with as few as 8 to 12 estimates providing results nearly as robust as much larger samples. 0.74. All of this, of course, assumes different sources of error, a nerdy way of saying that the people involved should have different ideas and assumptions. The danger here is that given the human tendency toward confirmation bias, we are prone to surround ourselves with people that are like us in many respects, thereby minimizing the potential benefit of this crowd wisdom. The practical fallout of this research for investors has at least 2 logical applications. First, we must always be able to articulate an edge when we expect prices to deviate sharply from their current state. After all, the price of a security at any given time reflects the consensus estimate of millions and millions of market participants. If we are bold enough to suggest that millions of people will soon be proven wrong, we'd better have a very strong reason for thinking so. Second, investment teams should make every effort possible to be as psychologically diverse as possible. All too often, investment committees are comprised of participants with nearly identical educational, socioeconomic, racial, and gender makeup, which is likely to result in cognitive homogeneity as well. Guess again. You now know that there is some wisdom in the crowd and that estimates with diverse sources of error tend to be better than those originating from a single source. But what's a savvy behavioral decision-maker to do when she finds herself all alone? Fear not, because through the process of dialectical bootstrapping, you can divide your mind in a way that tends to reduce decisional error. The dialectical part of this tongue-twisting concept arises from the work of the philosopher Georg Hegel, who proposed a 3-part method for discussing ideas that would lead to truth. First, there is the thesis or original idea, which then comes into contact with the antithesis, or some contrary opinion. After some discussion, Hegel thought rhetorical combatants ought then to arrive at a synthesis, a sort of logical middle ground between the 2 competing ideas. In security analysis, as in Hegel's philosophy, you likely have an opinion about a security that stems from a certain set of assumptions. Perhaps you are bullish on Acme Corporation's stock given your belief in their competitive moat, the strength of the broader economy, or any host of other considerations. This is your thesis and most financial analysts stop here. But what if you turned some of these assumptions on their head, performing a sort of pre-mortem as discussed previously? What if an upstart competitor threatens the Acme brand? What if an imbecilic president threatens a trade war that jeopardizes the economy? By considering these alternate scenarios, you arrive at an antithesis with a new accompanying price target. By averaging the price targets that are a result of your original and revised assumptions, you would arrive at a synthesis, a midpoint between the best and worst case scenarios. In an empirical examination of this idea, Herzog and Hertwig found that dialectical bootstrapping was a powerful tool for making better decisions. Although not quite as powerful as aggregating different people's opinions, the process of synthesizing multiple estimates based on different assumptions reduced error estimates in 75% of their sample. 75. You may not always have access to the wisdom of a crowd, but with the use of this simple process, a single mind can simulate the wisdom of many. In summary, ego risk is made manifest in behaviors that privilege our need for felt personal competency at the expense of clear-eyed decision-making. Specific examples might include good old-fashioned overconfidence, a tendency to become defensive when pet ideas are challenged, backfire effect, or a belief that one's mere involvement in a project makes it more likely to succeed, the awesomely named IKEA effect. Ego risk leaves specific evidence of its presence in a trading log that might include overly concentrated positions, churning, and the use of excessive leverage. Whatever the specific manifestation, the source is always the same: an ego that privileges its own care and feeding over making good decisions. It is a natural and unavoidable human tendency to want to feel different or better than average, but the enduring lesson of overconfidence for the behavioral investor is that it must be kept in its place. In love and life, hope for the best. When investing, play the odds. Crafting ego-resistant portfolios. Fact: we should check the ego, as investing has elements of both luck and skill. So what? Adherence to rules trumps personal genius. Fact: forecasts have a coin flip likelihood of being correct. So what? Projections about the future, if they must be proffered at all, should be based on an assumption around base rates on long-term averages, not stories. Fact: investors dramatically misremember their returns in their own favor. So what? Keep a log of trading decisions and monitor hit rate, performance, and external variables that might negatively impact financial decision-making. Also, ignore braggarts at cocktail parties. Fact: diversification is the lived embodiment of humility, and its primary good is the preservation of capital. So what? Remember that protecting against catastrophic decline is part owning enough different things and part knowing what you own. Fact: everyone thinks that they are a contrarian. So what? True contrarianism is painful and should cause considerable self-doubt. If your brand of swimming upstream doesn't hurt, it's unlikely to work. Notes: 58. An Ohio State study found that 80% of restaurants fail in the first 3 years. Lori Mealy, 10 Reasons Restaurants Fail. The Balanced Small Business, October 10, 2016. 59. T. Sharad, The Optimism Bias, May 2012. 60. D. Shariat Madari, Daniel Kahneman. What would I eliminate if I had a magic wand? Overconfidence, Guardian, July 18, 2015. 61. D. Moore and S. A. Swift, The Three Faces of Overconfidence in Organizations, in David de Kremer, Rolf van Dyck and J. K. Mernigan, eds. Social Psychology and Organizations, Routledge, 2012. 62. J. Zweig, in Benjamin Graham, The Intelligent Investor, Harper Business, 2006, page 374. 63. C. H. Brown, The Little Book of Value Investing, Wiley, 2006. 64. B. Malkiel, A Random Walk Down Wall Street, W. W. Norton and Company, 2016. 65. D. D. P. Johnson and J. H. Fowler, The Evolution of Overconfidence, Nature, 2011. 66. M. Mutakrishna, S. J. Heine, W. Toyokawa, T. Hamamura, T. Kamita and J. Henrik, Overconfidence is Universal? Depends what you mean, 2015. 67. J. Allen, F. F. Reichheld, B. Hamilton and R. Markey, Closing the Delivery Gap, Bain and Company, 2005. 68. M. W. Reap, Is Overconfidence Affecting Your Investing Outcomes? Charles Schwab, February 12, 2018. 69. M. Statman, S. Thorley and K. Vorkink, Investor Overconfidence and Trading Volume, AFA 2004 San Diego Meetings, 2003. 70. D. A. Moore, T. R. Kurtzberg, C. R. Fox and M. H. Bazerman, Positive Illusions and Forecasting Errors in Mutual Fund Investment Decisions, Organizational Behavior and Human Decision Processes 79-2. August 1999, pp. 95-114. 71. M. Glazer and M. Weber, Why Inexperienced Investors Do Not Learn. They Do Not Know Their Past Portfolio Performance, Finance Research Letters 4-4, 2007. 72. J. Stillman, 4 Tricks to Avoid Overconfidence, Inc. December 1, 2014. 73 SM Herzog and R. Hertwig. The Wisdom of Many in One Mind. Psychological Science 20-2, 2009. 74 R.M. Hogarth. A Note on Aggregating Opinions, Organizational Behavior and Human Performance 211. February 1978. pp. 40-46. 75 Herzog and Hertwig. The Wisdom of Many in One Mind. Com. Chapter 9. The Behavioral Investor Conquers Conservatism. Everyone thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing himself. Leo Tolstoy. A ship is safe in harbor, but that's not what ships are for. William G. T. Shedd. It's a quiet Saturday morning and you are sitting on your couch, enjoying the morning's first cup of coffee and an engrossing read by your favorite novelist. Quite unexpectedly, you hear a knock at the door and rise to see who has so thoughtlessly interrupted your weekend reverie. Standing at the door is an officious-looking man with a receding hairline, aviator sunglasses and a black suit. Flashing a badge ever so briefly, he introduces himself as Mr. Smith and informs you that he has some news that may be hard to hear. There has been a terrible mistake, he begins, your early morning buzz now quickly turning into anxiety. Your brain has been plugged by error into an experience creation machine created by neurophysiologists. Everything you have ever experienced in your life is a vivid simulation, a waking dream. Pausing to let the enormity of this revelation sink in, Mr. Smith now offers you a choice. He can unplug the simulation, allowing you to engage in real life, albeit a life you know nothing of, or you can remain hooked to your simulation. Mr. Smith is not a patient man and emphasizes that you must make a decision immediately. Which path do you choose? This scenario is a variant of a question posed by Philippe de Brigard, a researcher at Duke University, and his results might surprise you. Intuition tells us that contact with reality is an important consideration and that most of us will want to live in the real world, rather than drift along in some simulation cooked up in the mind of a neuroscientist. But among respondents to this study, 59% opted to stay hooked up to the machine compared to just 41% who opted for the red pill option. Our impulse to engage with reality may be strong, but it's not quite as strong as our pull for the familiar. Our tendency toward conservatism is also on display in arguably the most famous business case study of all time, Coca-Cola's introduction of New Coke in the 1980s. New Coke is discussed in B schools as a once-in-a-generation business miscalculation, but the logic of Coke executives would have been sound if they were dealing with rational Homo economicus and not fickle Homo sapiens. Coke would never undertake a change of that magnitude without extensive focus group testing, and indeed their numerous taste tests had found that blind taste testers preferred the sweeter flavor of New Coke by a significant margin. However, once introduced, Coca-Cola Classic continued to outsell New Coke by a factor of 3-1. As articulated nicely in Samuelson and Zeckhauser's article in the Journal of Risk and Uncertainty, even though there was a clear preference for the new beverage, the old favorite continued its sales dominance. People may have preferred the taste of New Coke, but that preference was overwhelmed by their comfort with the familiar. 76 The sources of conservatism. If our penchant for the status quo were just limited to silly matrix scenarios or cola preferences, it might not be worth our time, but the impact of our preference for conservatism has profound implication on the quality of both our lives and investment decisions. Military personnel often re-enlist simply because they are unaware of what other options might be at their disposal. 77 Sales professionals, who work so hard to position their product or service above that of the competition, are actually up against a far more formidable foe: inertia. According to the Sales Benchmark Index, 60% of qualified leads culminate in a no action, meaning that the potential customer just didn't make a choice. Retirement savers, tasked with the all-important mission of preparing a financial future, tend to just opt for whatever the company's default choice is, a tendency deftly turned to investor advantage by Richard Thaler and colleagues. 78 Yes, conservatism is everywhere. Psychological and neurological processes help account for its ubiquity. A study conducted at University College London examined neural pathways involved in status quo bias and found that the more difficult the decision we face, the more likely we are not to act. Participants in the study, which was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, were involved in a tennis line judgment game. While their brains were scanned using functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, Participants were shown a tennis ball landing near the line and had to determine whether it was in or out. In each case, they were given a default option and had to continue to hold down a button to assent to the default option and release the button to vote for a change. The results showed a consistent bias toward the default and noted that this bias became increasingly pronounced as the judgment calls become more pronounced. This tendency led to errors that became increasingly pronounced as the difficulty of the task increased. Meanwhile, the fMRI scans demonstrated that the subthalamic nucleus, STN, became activated in scenarios where the default was rejected. Researchers also noticed an uptick in activity in the prefrontal cortex, a region known for dealing with difficult mental problems. This early research suggests that the STN may be among the foremost parts of the brain involved with making difficult decisions and moving away from the status quo, an act that is effortful and cognitively expensive. 79 A second study found that erroneous rejections of an existing state have a more profound neural impact than erroneous status quo acceptances. Put simply, if you're going to make a mistake, your brain would rather you make a mistake by doing nothing. This asymmetry is consistent with the psychological notion of regret aversion, which finds that people are more upset with themselves when taking an action and suffering a loss than when staying put and suffering that same loss. Maintaining the status quo is not seen as a choice, however wrong-headed that is, and thus we tend to go easier on ourselves when complacency culminates in a bad outcome. 80 Much of what we observe as a behavioral bent toward conservatism may actually be down to how the brain processes information. In a calm state, it takes around 8 to 10 seconds for the brain to process new information, and that response time is lengthened considerably by the presence of stress. Having slowed the process to a crawl, stress may actually lead us to fixate on a single solution, likely the default or existing solution, and be unable to consider other options. Evolutionary psychologists think that this near paralysis may actually give some animals a survival advantage inasmuch as predators are unlikely to see prey that is stationary. But, just as the impulse for a deer to freeze is better in a forest than a freeway, your tendency to seize up belongs on the African plains and not on Wall Street. The human propensity toward conservatism, driven by some of the neurological processes discussed before, appears behaviorally as the interaction of a constellation of non-rational cognitive processes including the endowment effect, mere exposure effect, home bias, regret avoidance and loss aversion. Remember from our earlier discussion that the human brain and body are always looking to operate in the most parsimonious manner possible. Relying on what has worked in the past or what has always been done is a very cognitively efficient way to do just that. It's no wonder that as decisions become more complicated or the trade-offs become more tiring to consider, the tendency to stay put becomes more pronounced. Richard Thaler has suggested that this tendency is rooted in the endowment effect or our proneness to value something simply because it is ours. Whether that something is a method of viewing the world, a political ideology or even a physical item, we tend to love it just because we own it. While this tendency has obvious salutary effects on our feelings of self-worth, it makes it much harder to dispassionately evaluate the true worth of something familiar versus a new way of being. Daniel Kahneman attributes our inert behavior to our aversion to loss, arguing that the status quo becomes our reference point and that deviations from it, even some positive deviations, are seen as a loss. Given that potential losses are feared more than twice as much as potential gains are prized, old ways of acting tend to calcify. Tools for combating conservatism. You are now armed with the realization that you have a tendency to lean on the safe and familiar when making decisions and that this tendency can have dangerous consequences. How, practically, can we overcome this natural tendency toward conservatism? Give yourself the world. Home bias. The tendency toward viewing domestic equities as more safe and knowable than their international counterparts means that people all over the world are underinvested in countries outside of their own. As a rule of thumb, your percentage ownership of the equities of a given country should align roughly with the size of that market on the international stage. According to Morgan Stanley, the combined market capitalization of all U.S. stocks accounts for just under one-half of the world's total market value. However, U.S. investors have an average allocation to U.S. stocks of an incredible 90%. 81 This geographical favoritism even extends to regions of the United States, with Northeasterners tending to be overweight financials, Midwesterners tending to be heavy on agriculture and energy. And if this tendency to buy what you know is dangerous in the economic superpower that is the United States, consider how damaging it can be in countries that account for a smaller part of the world's market value. For instance, the average British investor keeps nearly 80% of their equity investments in British companies, in spite of the fact that Great Britain represents less than 10% of global market value. Incredibly, home bias seems to impact professional investors just as dramatically as novices. Researchers at the University of Manchester and Lancaster University surveyed fund managers in the United States, Great Britain, continental Europe and Japan and asked them about their expectations about U.S. stocks. Completed between 1995 and 1999, the 12-month forecasts of U.S. managers were far more bullish than among fund managers in other parts of the world. Similarly, when U.S. managers were asked about stocks in the other parts of the world, their expectations for growth were much lower than those of the managers in those countries. 82 Mark Twain famously quipped that, "Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts." Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth all one's lifetime. Twain was of course speaking of literally visiting new places, but investors would be wise to heed his view as it pertains to investing. There is a pervasive narrow-mindedness around investing in places unfamiliar. We would all be wise to recognize that industriousness and ingenuity are not the purview of any one place and invest accordingly. Choose tomorrow over today. The evolutionary roots of our system of self-preservation make sense. It was not all that long ago, in terms of evolutionary time, that our forebears were called upon daily to make life and death decisions. For people living on the savannas of Africa, choosing to zig when you should have zagged could spell the end. Historically, decision-making has been very wrapped up in preserving physical safety and ensuring that physical needs were met. In this life and death scenario, minimizing risk at the expense of self-actualization is only logical. However, in the intervening millennia, things have changed and our thought patterns have not kept pace. In the developed world, most people have the base of Maslow's pyramid met. They have adequate food, water, sleep and safety. Having now met these basic needs, they are left to wrangle with more metaphysical concerns such as belonging and self-actualization. What we are left with is a brain in a decision-making modality that is ill-suited for our modern milieu. We are programmed to choose safety, even at the expense of joy, in an environment where safety abounds and joy is hard to find. Unless we learn to train our brains to evaluate risk and reward on a more even keel, we will remain trapped in a life of risk aversion that keeps us from taking the very risks that might make us happy. Imagine that you are presented with just two different investment options, asset A and asset B, and that you must choose the least risky of these two options. Over the last 100+ years, asset A has outperformed asset B in 80% of rolling 10-year periods and has been on top in 100% of rolling 30-year periods, a time frame consistent with saving for retirement. Asset A has beaten inflation 100% of the time in rolling 20-year periods, whereas asset B has only beaten inflation 31% of the time. The inflation-adjusted annualized return of asset A is 7%, whereas asset B clocks in at 1%. Which of the two assets would you say is riskier, asset A or asset B? With the two assets identified like this, almost everyone would choose asset A as the less risky of the two. After all, failing to outperform inflation, as asset B did a majority of the time, is just a fancy way of saying, losing money. Asset A is stocks, generally considered to be far more risky than asset B, bonds. How is it then that our perception of risk is so grossly decoupled from the actual performance of these two asset classes? In markets as in life, people tend to evaluate risk in terms of short-term harm rather than long-term reward. Stocks undoubtedly offer the potential for short-term harm, despite the fact that they have been enormously predictable and rewarding over time. By privileging today over tomorrow and certain mediocrity over possible greatness, fearful investors provide behavioral investors with an equity risk premium that is improbably large. This premium can be earned by doing the opposite, by privileging tomorrow over today. Buy what you don't know. If I asked you to name the single most famous painting of all time, which would you choose? Odds are that many readers would have landed on Da Vinci's Mona Lisa, arguably the most iconic piece of art in the world. But did you know that what we now consider his masterwork was not too long ago considered a rather mediocre representation of his work? The story of how the Mona Lisa became the avatar of artistic excellence is one of criminal activity and intrigue that relies heavily on human psychology. In 1911, A handyman at the Louvre removed the painting from its place in the museum and took it home. The utter lack of security measures surrounding the Mona Lisa is a testament to its unextraordinary reputation at the time. It was over 24 hours until anyone even noticed that the painting was missing. But as newspapers started to report on the robbery, awareness of the painting increased as the mystery surrounding the heist became a full-blown media sensation. After it was recovered 2 years later, the Mona Lisa became the most popular painting in the museum, as interested patrons clamored to see what all of the fuss had been about. Only after the heist and in light of its newfound popularity did the Mona Lisa earn the reverence and esteem of the art world. We imagine that the Mona Lisa is popular because it is so special, but in reality, it is seen as special precisely because it first became popular. 83 The psychological term for this phenomenon is mere exposure effect, a process by which we develop a preference for something simply because we are familiar with it. Peter Lynch famously encouraged investors to buy what you know, to look at the products and services you use every day to source the next great stock pick. With all respect due to a truly incredible investor, this is profoundly dumb advice. Our conservative nature already means that we see less risk in the familiar and so are likely already overweight what we know. Our proclivity to conflate the known with the advisable is so pronounced that we actually perceive stocks with pronounceable tickers, e.g., MU, to be less risky than those with hard-to-pronounce tickers, e.g., NTT. So, rather than trying to scour your local mall for the next big investment idea, put in place a plan that diversifies across geographies and asset classes, both familiar and foreign. Don't know what you own. The trolley problem is a formulation used in many philosophy and ethics courses. A slight modification of the general form of the problem is as follows. There is a runaway trolley barreling down the railway tracks. Ahead, on the tracks, there are 5 people tied up and unable to move. The trolley is headed straight for them. You are standing some distance off in the train yard, next to a lever. If you pull this lever, the trolley will switch to a different set of tracks. However, you notice that there is one person, a friend of yours, tied up on the side track. You have 2 options. Do nothing, and the trolley kills the 5 people on the main track. Pull the lever, diverting the trolley onto the side track where it will kill your friend. Which of those admittedly unpleasant options would you choose? From a utilitarian standpoint, saving the most lives by pulling the lever is the most desirable outcome. All else equal, I think that many of us would agree that saving 5 lives is preferable to 1. However, I imagine that many of you choose not to pull the lever, despite the fact that it would have a dramatically more positive outcome in the most practical sense. There are 2 reasons why you likely chose as you did, both of which have their roots in conservatism. First, choosing to pull a lever to change the status quo feels like making a decision. Make no mistake, it's a decision either way, but action feels more volitional than inaction. Second, your friend benefits from a familiarity bias that you don't enjoy with the other 5 people. You know your friend and that knowing fundamentally alters your perception of right and wrong. A similar, though admittedly less dramatic, version of this is at play whenever you research, purchase and follow a stock. Through the endowment effect, your familiarity with and ownership of the security means that you elevate its perceived above its actual worth. The surest way around this? You shouldn't know what you own. This suggestion strikes most people as dramatic, but it is rooted in common sense. In fact, some fund managers have already embraced this idea. A USA Today article on behaviorally minded investment manager C. Thomas Howard reads, Thomas Howard may have one of the oddest investment approaches ever. The 66-year-old former business school professor buys and sells stocks without even knowing the names of the companies. He's got no idea how much he has paid for the stocks. And he doesn't bother to keep track of whether the stock is winning or losing. But, hey, in 12 years, through the wild ups and downs of Wall Street, this close-your-eyes approach has managed to average roughly 25% annual returns on his flagship Athena Pure Fund, making it one of the better investment products out there. 84 Inasmuch as ownership distorts perceptions of value and leads to poor buy and sell decisions, knowledge of ownership should be kept from the fund manager. Only then can he make rules-based, dispassionate decisions about what to buy and sell that are free from the shackles of the endowment effect. Embrace the messiness of risk. An exit door procedure at 30,000 feet? The illusion of safety. Tyler Durden's Fight Club rant about the duplicity of airline safety protocols could just as easily be applied to the feudal dance of financial advisors giving clients risk tolerance questionnaires. Risk tolerance questionnaires, RTQs, give the illusion of safety and insight, and fly in the face of research that suggests that risk-taking behavior is domain-specific, context-driven and dynamic. Some academics try to skirt this point through a bit of esoteric sleight of hand that distinguishes risk tolerance from risk perception. Risk tolerance is defined as your static, long-term attitudes about risk, whereas risk perception is the dynamic, contextual piece more likely to fluctuate during periods of market upheaval. Risk tolerance, academics are quick to point out, is unchanging and they have the studies to prove it. Essentially, they say, you can have the right idea at heart about risk-reward trade-offs, risk tolerance, even as you are engaging in the wrong behavior due to your risk perception in the heat of the moment. This ivory tower factoid is of very little practical use to investors who enter and exit the market at all the wrong times or the beleaguered investment advisors who take panicked phone calls from their clients. In the end, risk-taking behavior is all that matters and the fact remains that it is changeable and context-dependent. Some RTQs attempt to arrive at investor risk preferences by asking about non-financial risk-taking behavior. And while this invariably has the effect of spicing up what can otherwise be a fairly staid affair, your propensity to go bungee jumping has nothing to do with your ability to hold on to stocks during a bear market. As Nicholson, Fenton O'Creevy, Sohn and Willman point out, no single psychological questionnaire predicts risk-taking behavior across multiple domains, or explains why someone highly risk-averse in financial decision-making contexts would pursue extremely dangerous sports. 85 Another RTQ tactic is to ask about hypotheticals like, what would you do in the event of a 20% market correction? In the hope that this hypothetical would have some predictive power in a period of actual market turbulence. Once again, science gives a cold shower. Moreover, there has been little direct evidence of correlation between hypothetical financial decisions made on paper versus real financial decisions involving live market transactions. 86 A number of studies have shown that risk-taking behavior is tightly linked to the emotional state of the subject and the emotion-producing properties of the task. For instance, people take more risk when a task is framed negatively, this is what you might lose, versus positively, this is what you might gain. Mood is also closely correlated with risk-taking, and those who have positive mood-induced show distortions in their perceptions of risk. Andrew Lowe and colleagues make the case that risk-taking behavior is heavily influenced by situational variables as they interact with the emotional ability of the investor. These limitations suggest that risk-taking may be context-dependent, and that characterizing the context along some standardized dimensions may be a more productive line of inquiry. We propose that the emotional or affective state of the decision-maker and certain affective properties of the environment are plausible candidates for such a characterization. 87 Whereas most RTQs measure sterile, cerebral notions of risk, the messy lived experience of risk-taking occurs at the intersection of personal neuroticism and the fear-inducing nature of a given situation. Inasmuch as most RTQs fail to measure context or emotional reactivity, they are of limited utility. Perhaps this is why Jason Zweig reports that the test-retest reliability, i.e., the likelihood that the same person will get similar results on subsequent iterations of an assessment, of RTQs is a coin flip. Heraclitus' idea that no man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river and he's not the same man, is highly applicable to risk management. Remove the fear of loss. In the throes of the second worst financial crisis in United States history, auto manufacturer Hyundai introduced a program that shows a deep understanding of human psychology and might just have saved their company. With economic fears putting off large purchases and the fear of unemployment a reality for people of all economic strata, Hyundai introduced the Assurance Program, promising consumers that the company would buy back their car in the event that they lost their job. A mere 350 people ended up selling back their cars, but Hyundai's removal of the fear and anxiety surrounding the purchase led them to sell 435,000 vehicles in 2009, an 8% increase at a time when many automakers were approaching bankruptcy. 88 Perhaps the dirtiest little secret of active investment management today is that many managers are so fearful for their jobs that much of what passes for active fund management is simply passive investment management with active fees. Tom Howard of Athena Invest found in his exploration of closet indexing that, for the typical fund, low conviction positions outnumber high conviction positions by 3 to 1. 89 In their 2009 paper, Martin Kremers and Antti Petahisto introduced the concept of active share, or how greatly a portfolio differed from the benchmark against which it was compared. They found that truly active managers, those with 60% or greater differentiation from their index, had outperformed historically, and that greater differentiation tended to lead to greater outperformance. In his 2013 update, Petahisto found that high active share portfolios outperformed dramatically from 1990 to 2009, and that these active funds had tended to hold up well during periods of crisis. As he notes, I found that the most active stock pickers have been able to add value to their investors, beating their benchmark indices by about 1.26% per year after